Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer Cook. I am Gilpin County CSU Extension Director, and I'm also the Gilpin County Noxious Weed Manager. So that means I kind of survey and manage all the weeds in the county. I have a small budget, so I hire, luckily, I've had some grant money to hire Teens Inc. Youth Corps to pull a bunch of weeds the past few years. And then we also have a contractor that sprays. And then I also do a lot of pulling myself and managing. So I come with a lot of experience with noxious weeds. So we're going to go over a few of the most common noxious weeds here in the county. And then I'll have some time for questions at the end. So thanks for joining us. And for some reason, my slides are not advancing. Let's see. Sorry, everyone. Let me try this again. I apologize. Technical difficulties here. Everything was working right before everyone joined us. Okay, here we go. Hopefully everyone can see this. All right, so these are, I work with Colorado State University Extension, and these are our statements for equal opportunity access and non-discrimination. Okay, so why are noxious weeds a problem? If you look at this picture here, this is Oxeye Daisy. I've seen Oxeye Daisy quadruple in a year. So obviously they're taking over our native habitats. Usually they're from Europe or Asia, and so there's no natural controls. They're very adaptable. And Colorado defines a noxious weed as a plant that is non-native, that impacts the health, the economic, and environment, and has environmental impacts. And so Colorado Department of Agriculture actually manages the Noxious Weed Program, the Noxious Weed Act for Colorado. So they have actually specifically defined noxious weeds. And we'll go over some of those in a minute and how they're more laid out, list A, B, and C. But so basically Colorado, the state of Colorado, and there's a Gilpin County ordinance that was adopted in 1999 that says that everyone needs to control their noxious weeds in one way or another. So almost all counties have ordinances, and so it's just a part of knowing what plants are noxious weeds specifically and how to manage them. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So the as far as the noxious weed law, the weeds are divided into 3 sections: list A, B, and C species. So list A are generally those that are pretty rare. So like orange hawkweed, if any of you know what that looks like, that's pretty rare. So if you find that, if you have that on your property, they're suggesting that it must be eradicated. List B species are those that are a little more common. Something like Canada thistle is a list B species where you're meant to stop the spread of it as best you can. And then list C are even more common species. They're still considered noxious weeds, but those like cheatgrass, for example, where we see them in a lot of places. And so we just need to show that we're trying to manage it, but we know that we're probably never going to eradicate it. So that's how the Colorado Department of Agriculture divides out the noxious weed species. And Gilpin County follows the specific noxious weeds that are highlighted by the Colorado noxious weed law. So those are the ones that we're targeting with our educational programs and also our herbicide checkout program that I'll talk about at the end. So let's talk a little bit about biodiversity. It's important to understand that biodiversity is just like the variety of species in an ecosystem, and that's what's so special about Gilpin County. We have such a variety of plants and animals up here, and unfortunately, noxious weeds can easily crowd out our native plants and reducing the habitat for animals as well as our native plants. So the plants are kind of the bottom of the food chain. Kind of the bottom of the food chain. So our entire ecosystem is weakened if these noxious weeds take over a native habitat. So you can see in this picture, the cheatgrass is taking over, and these native wildflowers and grasses are food for a lot of our deer and elk and other wildlife. And so if these native sources disappear, it's also impacting our wildlife as well as our plants. So now let's start talking about management. And it's important to understand that there's always a seed bank. So even though we eradicate plants that are growing, there's still lots of seeds in the soil left for the following years. So persistence is really one of the most important things that you can, characteristics that one can have if you're trying to manage weeds, because a seed bank in the soil can be usually anywhere from 4 years to 30 years. The seeds can last and stay viable in the soil. So we have to stay persistent with our weed management. We can't just manage for 1 year and say, all right, done, I did it. So here's an example of how many seeds one plant can produce per year. So it's pretty unbelievable to see these numbers. I would guess that not all these seeds are viable, but there's so many seeds that are produced. That's one of the reasons why these plants are so aggressive. I'll just highlight one. Canada thistle is one that we all are pretty familiar with, up to 5,000 seeds per plant. So that's a lot. It's also motivation. It's discouraging, but it's also motivation to pull just one plant. If you see one plant on the side of the road, that's motivation to me to pull over and grab that plant and get all those seeds out of the potential seed bank for the future. Okay. So management, there's always lots of management options, and it really depends on how the plant grows. So your number one thing with managing noxious weeds is to be able to identify what the weed is, what its life cycle is, and the best ways to manage it. And I'm going to go over a little bit about that today, but you guys can always feel free to reach out to our office and we can help you through figuring out a management plan. But basically, there's 4 different management options: mechanical, biological, chemical, and preventative. So mechanical is like any pulling, grazing, mowing, tilling. There's also propane burners, so you could actually use fire to burn the weeds. And I've thought about doing that up here, but it makes me a little hesitant just because we have so much wind and potential like fire hazards up here. I would hate to start a fire just because I was trying to manage my Canada thistle. But it is an option. A biological control, I'll leave a contact information at the end for the Colorado, the Palisade Insectary. They sell biological controls for different species. Leafy Spurge is one that I got some and I'm trying this year, and we saw a little bit of impact so far on the plants, but I don't think it's enough to really manage the infestation. So most of the biological controls unfortunately don't work at our elevation, but we're still hopeful that some of them are. But there's like a rust and the Spurge beetle and a couple others, but yeah, most of them I don't think work up here very well. Chemical, of course, the herbicides. There's no silver bullet though, so even when we're using herbicides, they can be a little bit more impactful, but Often these plants are just so aggressive that you still need your persistence, and just 1 year of management with any of these is not going to be enough. And then, of course, preventative. So after you have any disturbance, like if you're building, constructing on your house or putting in a leach field, if you can throw some native grass seed or some plants down and just get something established before the weeds have a chance to come in, then that is a great preventative thing you can do. And we sell grass seed here and wildflower seeds, so you can always pop into our office and grab some of those. All right, so let's talk about, I'm going to just mention briefly about what is an annual, what's a biennial, and what is a perennial, because that really, knowing that can help indicate how is the best way to manage the specific weed. So an annual completes its life cycle in 1 year. They usually have really shallow roots because the main point of the plant is to produce seed. And reproduce in that way. So they're only reproducing by seed. So generally these annuals, they're very easy to pull out of the ground, and often the best way to management is pull and bag it so it doesn't go to seed and it doesn't spread. Next, we have biennials. So they have 2 years to complete their life cycle. The first year they create a rosette, like the picture here. The musk thistle, also common mullein, does this as well. It creates this rosette the first year. And then the second year, the flower and the seeds are produced. And again, biennials are only spreading by seed. So if you can just keep the seeds from getting out into the seed soil bank, then you're managing. So either digging up the rosette, or you can wait till it flowers and even cut and bag those flowers off, and then the plant will be dead after the second year. So perennials are really the most tough, the hardest to manage. So their life cycle is longer than 2 years. It's, they spread both by seed and vegetative matter, so they stay alive for years and years and years. They can spread through their fibrous roots or their rhizomes or their stolons, like these pictures show. And so they're a lot harder to manage, because if you pull it out of the ground, chances are there's still going to be some root left in the soil and will still grow some new shoots and allow for another plant to come up. So if you imagine, like Canada thistle is a perfect example of a very aggressive perennial that we all probably know about. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about, I'll go through some examples of annuals, biennials, and perennials, and show you some pictures, and we'll talk specifics about how we manage these plants. And if I didn't mention it earlier, if you have any questions, you can pop it into the chat box, and at the end, I'll do a Q&A. All right, so let's start with annual weeds. So remember, with annuals, the way to prevent these plants from spreading is to keep them from going to seed. And this is a picture of cheatgrass here. This is probably what most of our cheatgrass in the area looks like right now. It grows, produces seed, and then it browns up. And it's a pretty horrible plant. Here's what it looks like when it's green. It's a big nuisance to livestock, dogs. It sticks to our socks, so it really spreads that way pretty easily, as well as by wind. It's also a fire hazard. Once it dries out, it can light on fire very quickly. In fact, it had a lot to do with that Marshall fire spreading. Was that a few years ago? There was just so much cheatgrass that really helped the fire spread. So let's look at some control options. So we can pull it before it goes to seed, or even once it is seeded, before it browns and drops and spreads, you can still pull it and bag it. Fire, grazing, before it goes to seed, it is a palatable grass. So if you have grazing animals, they will eat it earlier in the season, but It's an annual, so its main purpose is to produce seeds in order to reproduce. So even if it's grazed down really low, it will probably still produce a seed. So unfortunately, that's not the only answer is grazing. Grazing can control it, but it will still probably stick around and spread. It's really easy to pull out of the ground. So if you just have a small area, pulling and bagging is the way to go. And then low rates of Roundup earlier in the winter or early spring, because it's a winter annual. So some of the seeds are probably germinating here pretty soon in this cool, as it gets cooler. And then in the early spring, well, late spring up here, they'll be germinating again. So there's a couple herbicides that work pretty well. Rejuvra is a new one. It's pretty expensive, but it works pretty well. And then Plateau. And Plateau is one that we have here in our herbicide checkout program. Cheatgrass is a little tricky. It's called cheatgrass because it's usually one of the first grasses to come up as soon as the snow melts. So it's kind of cheating ahead of everybody out, every other grass. But sometimes it's hard to identify until it goes to seed. So this is a cool picture to just help identify it before it goes to seed. It is, the entire plant has tiny hairs on it. So you can see in the picture, the stem and the leaves have tiny hairs. Sometimes you can't see them, but if you run your finger up and down the leaves, you'll feel that fuzzy. And then also the ligule, if you pull a leaf down away from the stem, it has a pretty pronounced ligule. It's kind of like, I always think of a tongue, but it has a membranous ligule, and not all grasses have that. So that's just another way to ID it. It also tends to turn purple as we get cooler nights here coming up soon. You'll see that cheatgrass might turn purple. So those are just ways to identify the cheatgrass without the seed head. Okay, let's move on to another annual. This is Scentless Chamomile. So notice the ferny leaves. So Oxeye Daisy and Scentless Chamomile have very similar flowers, but the ferny leaves is the way that you know that it is Scentless Chamomile. And this is an annual. It's very easy to pull out of the ground. If we remember from the beginning, one plant can produce 1 million seeds per plant, which is just unbelievable. But this is one you'll see as we head from Gilpin County into Nederland, like along the sides of the roads. This is one that's pretty bad in that area. And let's see what else. You can pull it and bag it. Mowing can suppress it, and you can also use herbicide. The seed becomes viable very quickly after it flowers. So this is a good one to keep after and just pull and bag as you see it flowering. I think it's within 5 or 10 days that the seed is viable once it flowers. And again, the leaves are ferny, and it looks very similar to our native pineapple plant. The pineapple plant, though, only grows, I don't know, maybe a few inches tall. This year it might be taller because we've had so much moisture. But if you're not sure if it's a pineapple plant or if it's the scentless chamomile, you can rub the leaves in your fingers like that, and then smell your fingers. And if your fingers smell sweet, like a pineapple, then it's the native. And if it's just doesn't have a smell, then it's the scentless chamomile. Okay, moving on to biennial weeds. So biennials, remember, they produce their seed the second year. So the first year they have the rosette, and then the second year they produce the seed. And the trick to biennials is to keep them from going to seed. So here's our first biennial. A lot of you know this one. We've had so much rain. This is one that I'm just seeing everywhere this year. Well, I'm seeing most weeds everywhere this year. I'm sure you all are too. So common mullein has fuzzy leaves. So if you are using herbicide, you want to make sure you use a surfactant with it to help it bind to the plant. Otherwise, it'll just run off the surface of the plant. Common mullein, though, is pretty easy to just dig up. The first year when it's a rosette, you can dig it out of the ground pretty easily. You don't even really need to bag it. And then even now with all this rain, it's been pretty easy to pull up the second year plants that already have the tall plant and flower. It's been pretty easy to pull them out of the ground this year. And then another option is you can wait until about September, October. So the yellow flowers eventually turn to the seed, and then the seed is how it's spreading. So you could take a pair of pruners late in the season, and cut and bag all those the yellow flower heads on top, cut and bag those, and then the plant will die. So there's lots of different easy organic ways to manage this, as well as spraying it with herbicide. Milestone is one that we have with our herbicide checkout program as well. Okay, here's another biennial. Musk Thistle, another one I'm seeing a lot of this year. It only spreads by seed, right? So the first year is a rosette, second year it flowers, and then the plant dies. It can produce up to 20,000 seeds per plant. So this is another one that creates a lot of seeds. So again, similar to the musk, we can cut and bag the flowers once it flowers, and then the plant will die. We can use herbicide on it earlier in the season before it flowers. We can pull the whole plant out of the ground. Horses and cattle may eat the flower. So if you're in a pasture situation, they may or may not eat the flower. One thing to think about, though, with grazing animals is that most of the times the seeds are going to run through their system and then come out the other end. So if there's viable seeds that they're eating, then they may be spreading through their manure dropping if they're moving from pasture to pasture. So just something to consider. So that's musk thistle. And so let's move on to perennial weeds now. So perennial weeds, they're really tough to control. This picture is not that great. It's pretty blurry. I apologize. But so this is a picture of Canada thistle roots, 2 years of underground growth, and it produced all this. Canada thistle can grow 20 feet deep and 15 feet laterally. So I'm sure many of you have experience with Canada thistle. It's a tough one to really completely get rid of. Here's some other pictures of Canada thistle. The rosette, or the early seedling, is usually a little bit thinner than the musk thistle. So that's kind of how you can tell the difference. It's a thinner plant, and then the flowers aren't as big as musk thistle. So for Canada thistle, herbicides, I'd say for perennial plants, if you're going to use herbicides, that's when I would really recommend them. I like to be prudent with herbicides and do other methods if possible, but with perennials, often that is the only option. However, I am happy to report that I have had a patch of thistles in my yard for the past 4 years. I've been very persistent about pulling it like literally every 2 weeks during the growing season. And so this will be the 4th summer that I had pulled it, and I didn't see it return, even with all this rain. So if you have smaller patches that are easy to just pull, and you're willing to be very persistent throughout the entire growing season for multiple years, I can report that I've had a successful project in being able to manage that. So that's good. But yeah, many of us have a lot, like this picture here, a lot of thistles. So often spraying may be the only option. If it's already flowering though, when you're spraying, cut and bag the flowers because they still might produce viable seed. You can also mow it, every month, or pull it regularly. That doesn't, unless you're very persistent with pulling, it won't completely manage it. Mowing won't completely manage it. It'll just keep it in place, keep it from spreading. So if that is okay with you, then that's fine with us too. Canada thistles are list B species, so we have to show management and keep it from spreading. So if we're just going to mow it and keep it from going to seed, that's fine. It's important to, with any noxious weed, to spot treat escaped plants. So either pulling or spraying escaped plants, so they don't spread to other areas. And then Canada thistle in particular, if you have it in an area where you might be using nitrogen fertilizer, you're going to make it happier. If you're also in an area where you want to try tilling it, that might also make it happier because of all those aggressive underground roots. It's going to take multiple years to manage this one. Just a little quick note on thistles. So we do have a lot of native thistles up here. So just be careful with making sure you're identifying the right thistle, and Canada and Musk are the two that we want to manage. Those are the noxious weeds, but we have a handful of these natives. A good way to know if it's a native or not, here's some more pictures, is that if it has a white flower, it's definitely a native. If it's above tree line, it's definitely a native. If it's growing in just a few, like 2 to 4 plants in an area, then it's a native. If it's pretty short, then it's a native. Our noxious thistles are going to be very aggressive. They'll take over an area. They tend to be taller, and they also have pink flowers. Okay, moving on to Oxeye Daisy. You can see the rosettes are kind of lobed leaves there. And then the flowers again look similar to that scentless chamomile, but this is a perennial. And also the leaves look quite a bit different. I've seen these quadruple quickly up at the Moffat Tunnel. I've been involved in a project there at around the trailhead heads. They've been managing Oxeye Daisy for 20 years. It looks fabulous. I was up there this year, and a lot of it is really controlled by hand pulling and by spot spraying, but literally 20 years of management. So this one, once it gets a hold of an area, it's a really tough one to manage. What is nice about it though is the roots are pretty shallow for a perennial, so it's fairly easy to pull those the plants out of the ground and bag them. But it is pretty aggressive. It's going to take multiple years to manage, pulling and digging and bagging to keep the seeds from spreading, and also herbicide before it flowers is ideal. You could also mow it before it flowers to just keep the population from spreading, but that will never completely get rid of the plant. Unfortunately, we see this wildflower in seed mixes because it's another one of those escaped perennials. Many of our noxious weeds are escaped ornamentals, excuse me. Many of our noxious weeds are escaped ornamentals, so they came to us from other countries or other states, and have just been ended up being really aggressive here in our environment and ecosystem. So if you get flower seed mixes from out of state, make sure you read to see what's in it, and don't spread Oxeye Daisy, please. Many people ask what's the difference between Shasta and Oxeye. It's really hard to tell. The obvious difference here in this picture on the left is the Shasta daisy. It's taller, it has bigger leaves, Whereas the oxeye on the right has smaller leaves. The leaves tend to be a little bit more lobed, especially at the base. But if you really have to have an eye for it to know the difference. So again, if you have any questions about what plant you have, you can always send us pictures, or I can do a field visit. Shasta daisy is not going to spread like Oxeye daisy though. So if you have an area that's obviously infested with a daisy, it's going to be Oxeye daisy. All right, moving on to knapweeds. We have two different knapweeds, spotted knapweed and diffuse knapweed. This is pictures of diffuse knapweed. And I'm just going to go to the spotted knapweed so you can see the pictures. So purple or white flowers, they're usually growing side by side, the spotted and the diffuse. They can also hybridize. So that's really what a lot of what we're seeing today is like a hybridization of the two. The tricky thing about these knapweeds is that they can be annuals, they can be biennials, or they can be perennials. So sometimes they're kind of tough to know how to manage them, but they are fairly easy to dig up out of the ground. And their rosettes are pretty interesting looking. So that's why I put a couple pictures of the rosettes and specifically the leaves. Sometimes it's hard to really know what they are until they flower, and then it might be too late. But you definitely want to keep, bag the flowers, keep it from flowering. It's easy to dig up, and you can also, use herbicide before it flowers on the seedlings. Okay, we're nearing towards the end, so hang with me here. This is another perennial. This is the perennial that I love to hate. It's Leafy Spurge. You can see when you snap the stem, it has this milky latex that is actually fairly dangerous. If you touch it, get it on your eyes, it can cause blindness. If you get it on your skin, it can cause rashes. It's poisonous for animals to eat. It can cause blisters on their skin, except for sheep and goats, which they can actually graze it and be a method for management, which is cool. But for horse and cattle and other grazing animals, it can cause blisters, so they usually tend to stay away from it. And also it has this really deep root system that it can produce shoots from any part of the root in the ground, similar to the Canada thistle. Again, a combination attack, which is really a good way to describe the method of noxious weed management in general. We can mow it to suppress it from going to seed. And there's also, like I said, several species of flea beetle that you could try to introduce to see if they could, what the flea beetles do is they eat the leaves and the flower buds. And the idea is eventually it will reduce the population of the plants. But like I said, I haven't really seen much positive impact from using those flea beetles in a couple of situations up here. So I'm not sure if that should be your only method. I feel like a combination method. Supposedly you can still use herbicide in combination with the flea beetle. It's called Leafy Spurge because it actually explodes the seeds from the seed head, from the seed packets. So it's so that's why it has its name. But really be careful when you're managing this. Use gloves, make sure you have glasses on, sunglasses even. I definitely gear up whenever I pull this one because of that latex. It's just kind of dangerous. Don't want to mess with it. Don't want to get it on your skin. And like I said, it's also poisonous for animals, except for sheep and goats who can be trained to graze it. Okay, this next one is called yellow toadflax. It's escaped ornamental, like many of our noxious weeds are. Another name for it is butter and eggs. It looks similar to the leafy spurge before the flower. Once it flowers, it's obvious that it's yellow toadflax, but before, they look pretty similar. So the way you can tell if it's one or the other is snap the stem and see if there's any milky latex. With this yellow toadflax, there's no milky latex. So again, persistent hand pulling is actually, you can be successful with this one, you know, just really being regular with it though, and not letting it go to seed to spread. And then late summer to fall herbicide application can work pretty well on this one. I've had pretty good success managing yellow toadflax with a late summer application of herbicide up here. And I think this is our last weed. Let's see how we're doing on time. Perfect. Yeah, so Chinese Clematis. This one I don't see very often in the county, except for along 119, along the Clear Creek. You can usually see the picture on the left. This happens in the fall. The yellow flower turns to these like wispy seeds, and that's when you really notice it. And it's a climber. It likes to climb and vine up plants. So that makes it hard to control because you often have collateral damage if you're trying to spray it. So your best bet really is to find it and manage it earlier in the season before it's climbed too far. You can pull it out of the ground, just make sure you get most of the roots. You can dig it and bag it, and then also spot spraying it with 2,4-D, just being careful about collateral damage. I'm going to go back to the picture again. It's the 4-petaled yellow flower. That is a good way to know that it's Chinese Clematis. Okay. We got through all those noxious weed examples. I certainly didn't cover all of them, but I don't want to overwhelm you guys with too much information. But luckily we have lots of resources here at the CSU Extension office. Those of you who don't know, we're right next to the rec center in the exhibit barn building. We have this herbicide checkout program for noxious weeds only that the county pays for. So we have sprayers and a few different herbicides. So depending on what type of weed you have, we can guide you on what herbicide to use, how to mix it, how much to mix, and exactly what to do with it through the program. And it's just a $125 deposit that you get back when you return all the equipment. So if you're interested, please feel free to contact our office. Here's my number, my email, and also our website could be a good resource for you. I think Becky can put our website in the chat. And then I also put here the Colorado Department of Agriculture insectary in Palisade. That is where you can purchase these biocontrols if you want to just try an alternative way to manage some of your weeds. They have a handful of biocontrols that you can purchase, and then they usually come in like a cooler in the mail, and you want to get them out as soon as possible, and they give you instructions on how to do it. The concern here is just that I haven't really seen much success of them surviving the winter. Our winters are pretty harsh. And then lastly, I have these noxious weed books that hopefully many of you, please feel free to come in and pick up a free book. I think I got a box of 50 of these. They go through all the list A, B, and C species. They have some nice photos and then descriptions of the plant and how to manage it. Actually, I don't know if they have how to manage it, but they have descriptions of what they look like and how to identify them. We can help you figure out how to manage it. So please feel free to stop in our office and pick up this free weed booklet. There's our address and our phone number. We're here Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30. Although we don't always have someone here in the office because we're out in the field a lot. So it's best to call ahead to make sure someone can be here to help you. And I think that's the end of my presentation. I'll take questions. And then maybe Becky, I don't know if you have any questions. Or if anyone else has questions, you can put them in the chat.
Hey, Jen, it's Becky. So I'm just gonna copy and paste everyone's questions so far from the chat. So bear with me for a second.
Okay.
One moment. Let me get
And if anyone wants to speak instead of type, you can just unmute yourself and ask a question.
So, Jen, can you see all the questions? I just compiled them in the chat, and they're on there by name and then that person's question.
Let me see if I can get to the chat here. Do you want to start reading the questions to me?
Sure. Yep. So Wes asked, are there any other chamomile plants besides scentless?
Yeah, sure. The one that we probably know of, the chamomile, that is an herb that you can use as tea. It's in the same family. It looks similar, but it's not the same species. It's a smaller plant. So yeah, don't be confused by the two of those. The chamomile that you use for tea is not as aggressive. And it has a smaller flower.
Then Rex, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
And then Rex asked, are other counties like Jefferson doing these activities? Because I do not hear them pushing on all these noxious weeds. And then further went on to say, psychologically, is it difficult to convince folks to fight noxious flowers when they look pretty?
Yes, it is. Yeah, the Oxeye Daisy and the Scentless Chamomile. I think it's just people don't even realize that they're noxious weeds because they look pretty. But then I think once people realize and they learn, how bad they can be, how aggressive they can be, I think people jump on the bandwagon of controlling them. But yeah, it's hard to hate those pretty flowers. And as far as your question about the other counties like Jefferson do have a noxious weed program. Each county's kind of doing their own thing, but we're all enforcing. I mean, I guess that's another question. I think someone emailed me this earlier today about enforcement. Because I'm the noxious weed coordinator for the county. I'm not necessarily the enforcer, but if you email me like if your neighbor or something isn't managing their weeds, you can send me the address. I'll go check it out and try to contact them to help them figure out how to manage. And then if people don't manage, they're just outright disregarding our suggestions, then we send them to the county planning office, and they can actually eventually put a lien on the property. So I mean, it's an ordinance that's enforced, and so people need to comply.
Okay. Cecilia asked, is it too late to spray for Oxeye daisies?
Oxeye daisies are already flowering. What you could do at this point is pull and bag the flowers, but then still spot treat the rosettes, the smaller part of the plant at the base of the ground that have those little lobed leaves. Because it's a perennial, it's still worth spraying those to keep them from spreading for future years.
Okay. Jen, are you able to see the chat?
Yeah, but I wasn't really keeping up with all the.
So at the very bottom, there's like 10 questions after the ones that I just put. Rex asked, yellow pale Elysium is driving me crazy due to the seed bank. Is that a noxious weed?
Yeah, let's see, I'm gonna have to look up this one. There's a I forget, it's a Alyssum. I might have to get back to you on that one. There's a hoary cress that is an Alyssum that in the mustard family. And then there is an Alyssum, I think that is a noxious weed, but off the top of my head, I'm not positive if that one is. I might get back to you guys on that one.
Okay. Todd said if you pull biennials the first year, you don't need to bag them, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then he also commented, scentless chamomile in my area is generally along roads where natives don't grow. How can I convince neighbors that it's a problem?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, it is along roadsides in lots of neighborhoods. We have brochures that I've been known to just leave with neighbors, or leave in their at the doorstep or something, that talks about why these are noxious weeds, why they're important to manage, and how easy they are to manage, especially the scentless chamomile. So if those brochures will be helpful for you, we have them on our website, or you can also pop in the office and we can give you a handful of them. You can also take this noxious weed book and give it to neighbors and friends. It's usually just a discussion of, why it really matters, why, how they're taking away our native habitats. But some people, just like anything else, we can't convince everyone. And so we do what we can. That's all I can say. I mean, not everyone is going to be convinced. Not everyone gets out of their house and really cares about the plants around them.
Okay, the next question is, can musk and Canada thistle both be pulled by hand? I thought one of them would send up extra stems if you leave any of the taproot behind.
That's right. The musk thistle is the biennial, so you can pull that one out of the ground pretty easily to manage it. But the Canada thistle is the one that's a perennial, so it has pretty aggressive root systems. Whenever I pull that one, I usually try and use a shovel or a hand trowel and get down as deep as I can into the ground and try and pull out as much of the root as possible. You can never know if you've gotten the whole root, but like I said, I've seen results doing that on like newer patches of Canada thistle, but if you have an established patch, it's really hard to manage with just digging it out of the ground.
Okay, next, are there any native plants that one might confuse with a mullein rosette or like a musk thistle rosette?
The mulleins, the common mulleins, yeah, I think next year I'm going to do a noxious weed lookalike class, so we can talk more about this. But I think the evening primrose can be mistaken. That one maybe is more like yellow toadflax, and evening primrose look similar. But for the musk thistle, the gentian, native gentian plant looks similar until you get up close and see that the leaves aren't fuzzy at all, where the mullein definitely has fuzzy leaves. And then the other one was the musk thistle lookalikes. I think that one, just Canada thistle, people confuse the Canada and the musk. It's sometimes hard to tell those apart unless you have a keen eye for it.
Okay. Someone commented there was a thistle with a very pretty white flower all along 119. Is that a noxious weed?
Nope, that's a native. I haven't necessarily seen it along 119, but I've seen it a lot this year. A lot of native thistles this year, I guess because of all the moisture. If it's a white flower and it's a thistle, then it's a native. We don't have all the noxious thistles are pink flowered. Good question.
Okay, hold on one second. I'm just responding to one of the questions. Let's see. One moment. Um,
I see Barbara's question about
yes.
cutting Canada thistle when it has flowered but not seeded helps control the plant. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. So, especially with perennials in the spring and in the fall, is whenever they're trying to pull a lot of their reserves back towards the roots so that they can last through the winter. So they're vulnerable then. And then also right before they're flowering, so just at the bud stage, right before the flower produces, they're also putting a lot of their energy into that flower. And so they're, I guess you could call it a vulnerable time too. So yeah, waiting until it's just at the bud stage and cutting it can really put the plant back. I don't know that you'll absolutely control it that way, but cutting it at that time is a perfect time to cut the plant. That's when you'll do the most damage with cutting it. Good question.
Jen, did you see, the question was, what about prickly lettuce? Is it considered a noxious plant? It seems to be really aggressive.
Prickly lettuce is not a noxious weed. I have seen a lot of that this year too, just with all this moisture. It's really easy to pull out of the ground. It has a little white flower that it spreads. It's an annual. So if you can just keep it from flowering, pull it out of the ground, use some leather gloves because it's prickly, but it's a fairly easy one to manage.
Mary asked, are there any groups of locals doing group weed pulls?
Not that I know of, not that it's not happening. I know some neighborhoods like Paradise Valley get together and they take out all of our sprayers and our herbicide and do like a weekend of weed spraying and pulling. I'm sure that happens in other neighborhoods that I don't know about. But as far as an organized group of volunteers, that's one thing I've kind of thought about trying to organize. So if people are interested, I'd love to maybe get a group of volunteers together, give them some pretty good training, and then you could work with me to pull and or spray or whatever you're comfortable with. Reach out and let me know and we'll get a group started.
Mary asked, she said that there's a lot of milk thistle in Netherland. She said it has serrated leaves, a milky interior, and sprouts a long stem with yellow flowers. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know about that plant. If you can send me a picture, I can tell you more or bring in a sample or something. We can talk about that more. I'm not sure exactly the type of plant that you're talking about. Sorry.
And then just there were a couple questions about us posting the recording. We will, once we get the recording set, we will post it on our website just for everyone. And it will be located under the classes and events tab, which you can locate from the main page on our website. And I put the website address in the chat earlier, but I can post it again here in a moment.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sure.
And also, we have a little evaluation that we're going to email to everyone. If you can take a few minutes to fill it out, it's just helpful for us to know how impactful these presentations are and also give us ideas for future presentations. So thanks everyone for joining us. Please always feel free to stop in, give us a call or stop in the office if you have questions, and we're here to help and educate the community.
Jen,
Thanks
I
for
just
taking
put
the
that.
time tonight.
Oh, I'm sorry for interrupting. I just put that Survey Monkey link in there for anyone who wants to go ahead and grab that and complete that survey now. Otherwise, I will send it out in an email and you can participate as you would like.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.